The grand courtroom was suffocating under the weight of expectation. It's a kind of atmosphere that seemed to thicken the very air until every breath carried the pulse of anticipation. And though countless high-profile cases had passed through the Supreme Court's chambers over the years, this day bore a peculiar tension because Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman known for her fiery presence and unshakable command of the law, stood poised not as a spectator, but as a force the justices had not anticipated facing on such direct terms. Chief Justice John Roberts, whose years on the bench had taught him the art of subtle intimidation, of guiding proceedings with measured tone and carefully chosen words that often bent the confidence of even seasoned attorneys, was convinced that he could test her resolve, chip away at the raw intensity that had earned her recognition in Congress and in the courtroom alike. But what he had not yet realized was that Jasmine Crockett had walked into this chamber already prepared for every weapon he might wield. Her eyes were steady, her hands calmly folded on the table before her. And in that serenity, there was no hint of timidity, but rather the quiet thunder of someone who knew that brilliance and preparation could dismantle even the loftiest veneer of judicial authority. Around them, the courtroom filled with murmurs from aides, clerks, and members of the public granted access to this extraordinary proceeding. Whispers that carried the names of Roberts and Crockett like the first tremors of an earthquake. But Jasmine paid them no mind. She was focused only on the towering figure across from her, the Chief Justice who had made a career out of subtle dominance. She was already scripting the rhythm of her counterattack in the private theater of her mind. Roberts leaned forward, his fingers steepled in that way he often did when signaling intellectual superiority. And he let silence hang until it began to scrape at the nerves of those less disciplined than Jasmine. When he finally spoke, his voice low, measured, calculated to project both wisdom and warning, it rolled through the chamber like a chill. He asked her a question that was less about the law at hand and more about undermining her. A question framed to suggest she was stepping into a world she did not fully grasp. And in that carefully crafted moment, he believed he had already tilted the balance at Jasmine. Instead of bristling or retreating, lifted her chin and let a small, almost imperceptible smile play across her lips. A smile that spoke not of arrogance, but of certainty, the kind of certainty that told everyone watching. She had expected this gambit and had already prepared the words that would dismantle it. Her voice, when it came, was firm but melodic, weaving precedent, its constitutional principle, and razor-sharp analysis into a reply so unflinching that even some of the associate justices shifted in their seats, recognizing instantly that the Chief Justice's attempt at intimidation has been not merely deflected but inverted into an opportunity for her to demonstrate her mastery. As she spoke, she threaded her narrative with historical references, dissected the nuances of case law with surgical precision, and layered her argument with such depth that Roberts found himself unable to interrupt without risking exposure of a weakness in his own framing. And though he masked it well, the tiniest flicker of surprise in his eyes betrayed to those watching that Jasmine Crockett was not merely holding her own, but was orchestrating a lesson in legal genius under the gaze of the entire nation. What unsettled John Roberts was not only the precision of Jasmine Crockett's words, but the way she seemed to occupy the space of the courtroom as if she had been destined for it all along. And while he had spent years perfecting his ability to draw attorneys and litigants into a rhythm that he controlled, here was someone who refused to dance to his tune, someone who, through the sheer force of intellect and presence, began to bend the environment itself until even the clerks sitting at the edge of the chamber leaned forward as if listening to a symphony they had not known they longed to hear. Roberts leaned back slightly, attempting to compose himself behind the neutral mask of judicial restraint. But the truth was gnawing at him. She was dismantling the scaffolding of his authority piece by piece, not by defying decorum, but by redefining it, demonstrating that respect for the court did not mean submission to intimidation. She cited obscure yet pivotal rulings, weaving them seamlessly into her larger argument. And each citation was delivered with such ease, it was as though she had written the opinions herself, her cadence unbroken, her tone unwavering, and the effect was hypnotic. Roberts had always prided himself on being the intellectual anchor of the bench, the steady hand that preserved its integrity even amid political storms. But But Jasmine exposed the cracks in his assumptions by reminding him, and everyone else listening, that the Constitution was not a static monument to be guarded by gatekeepers, but a living instrument designed for resilience and adaptation. The audience, though forbidden from open displays of approval, shifted in their seats with subtle energy, the kind that grows when people sense history being written before their eyes. And though no applause rang out, the silence itself became a form of ovation, a collective acknowledgement that what Jasmine was doing was extraordinary. Roberts cleared his throat, searching for a line of questioning sharp enough to cut through her momentum, and finally interjected with a challenge that struck at the core of her interpretation. A question laced with the suggestion that her analysis, while eloquent, ignored the practical consequences that centuries of judicial prudence had sought to prevent. It was a masterstroke of courtroom strategy, the sort of pivot that often left advocates scrambling to reframe their points, but Jasmine did not flinch. Instead, she drew breath and began unraveling his question with a clarity that left no thread intact, transforming his challenge into a platform for expanding her argument even further. Her counter was so thorough, so layered in logic and historical grounding, that it became evident to all that Roberts had not ensnared her. He had opened the door for her to demonstrate the full measure of her genius. The Chief Justice, for all his composure, felt the sting of that realization. Because it was one thing to be opposed by a skilled lawyer, and another entirely to be bested, point for point, in the very arena he had ruled for decades. Jasmine's words flowed like a river gaining force, sweeping aside the boulders he had placed in her path, and by the time she concluded, the chamber seemed to hum with the unspoken recognition that the attempt to intimidate her had collapsed into something resembling reverence. Even the associate justices, who often deferred to Roberts' framing, exchanged glances, their expressions carrying a mixture of astonishment and admiration. And though Roberts forced a polite nod as if conceding nothing, inside he was wrestling with the truth he had long resisted. Brilliance could not be subdued by title, robe, or tradition when it radiated with such undeniable force. By the time the proceedings stretched into their second hour, the balance of power inside the courtroom had shifted in a way so subtle, yet so profound, that even the most casual observer could sense it. Because whereas Judge John Roberts had entered, with the unspoken presumption of authority, the natural expectation that his voice and presence alone would guide and dominate the discourse, Jasmine Crockett now commanded the room through the raw gravity of unassailable reasoning, her every phrase pulling the attention of the justices, clerks, and spectators as if tethered by an invisible force. Roberts attempted again to assert himself. Interrupting her mid-sentence with a question meant not only to redirect the conversation, but to remind everyone of his prerogative as Chief Justice. Yet the moment his words fell into the air, Jasmine responded without hesitation, her reply so quick, so precise, that it appeared she had anticipated the interruption before it ever left his lips. That alone unsettled him, because intimidation relied on unpredictability, on catching one's opponent off guard, but here she was, dismantling the tactic before it could even bloom. Her eyes steady, her posture unbothered, and in that poise was the kind of mastery that could not be faked. She turned his question into a teaching moment, elaborating on principles of constitutional law that seemed to stretch back into the very marrow of American history. And as she spoke, she summoned cases, precedents, and philosophical interpretations, with a fluency that made her seem less like a participant and more like the embodiment of the law itself. At points, she cited Justice Thurgood Marshall, weaving his words into the foundation of her argument. At others, she invoked Sandra Day O'Connor, underscoring the nuanced balance between tradition and progress, and in doing so she reminded the court and the nation that genius is not merely in the recitation of precedent, but in the weaving together of history and principle to light a path forward. Roberts, who had always prided himself on subtle control, felt the weight of that brilliance pressing against him. And though he masked it with the calm exterior that had carried him through decades of high-pressure deliberation, there was an unmistakable tension in the set of his jaw, in the way his fingers tightened around the bench, as though gripping for balance against the storm that Jasmine had unleashed. The room itself had grown so still that one could almost hear the faint scratch of clerks' pens racing to capture every word she spoke. Because everyone present knew they were not merely recording arguments. They were transcribing a moment destined for history books. And though Robert still tried to interject, still sought footholds from which to reclaim his stature, each attempt only further illuminated Jasmine's mastery, because she answered not with hostility, but with elegance, never raising her voice, never losing her calm, always redirecting the conversation back to the heart of the matter with such clarity that his questions seemed less like challenges and more like stepping stones she had placed in advance. It became increasingly clear, even to Roberts himself, that the intimidation he had sought to wield had been shattered. That he now stood not as the unassailable arbiter of law, but as the reluctant witness to the ascension of a new kind of brilliance. One that did not bow to rank or tradition, but that stood on its own, undeniable and immovable, like the Constitution itself, written into human form. And in that realization, buried beneath layers of pride and habit, stirred in Roberts not merely frustration, but something he had not anticipated feeling toward Jasmine Crockett. Respect, the kind that arises only when one recognizes they are in the presence of greatness. And though he would never admit it aloud in that moment, the quiet shift in his demeanor told the story that words could not. The Chief Justice of the United States had discovered he could not break her. And that knowledge alone was enough to alter the course of the day, perhaps even the course of the institution itself.